I will reward you with your lives.
There's been a lot of talk going around that Sony might try to make a solo movie just for Null before using him anywhere else, but that idea honestly doesn't feel like the right move. It might sound exciting at first because Null is such a huge and powerful character, but his story is way too big to be squeezed into a single film. Because of that, it makes more sense to look at him as something larger, something that builds over time instead of being rushed. So instead of thinking about one standalone movie, it's better to think about how Null could shape multiple projects, especially if he's being set up as a major force in the universe. After that big reveal, it really starts to feel like Sony's Spider-Man universe has some serious long-term plans for Null, especially following his debut in Venom: The Last Dance. That movie is set to release on October 25th, and the subtitle alone already gives off the feeling that this might be the final solo story for Venom. But right after that, Kraven the Hunter is coming out on December 13th, which continues Sony's pattern of building origin stories for Spider-Man villains. Although when you look beyond those two films, things get a bit unclear because there aren't many confirmed projects lined up. And that kind of silence makes it seem like Sony is waiting to see how these upcoming movies perform before committing to anything bigger. That situation actually makes sense when you consider how the previous films did. Movies like Morbius and Madam Web didn't perform well, so it's understandable that the studio might be cautious now. If the next couple of movies don't succeed either, it could seriously hurt the future of the entire franchise. But even though the release slate looks empty, the reveal of Null changes the conversation a lot. It suggests that there are still big ideas behind the scenes, even if they haven't been officially announced yet. When it comes to Null himself, he's not just another villain, he's being introduced as the main antagonist in Venom: The Last Dance, and that already puts him on a completely different level. The trailers have shown glimpses of him, and they confirm that he's the creator of the symbiotes. He's also the one responsible for sending waves of symbiote creatures to Earth, which instantly raises the stakes. Even though the footage doesn't reveal too much about him, there's a lot from the comics that helps explain what kind of character he is and why he matters so much. In the comics, Null is basically a primordial god who existed before most of the universe even took shape. He lived in darkness, and when light entered his realm, it disrupted everything. Because of that, he created the first symbiote and used it to forge a weapon known as the Necrosword. He even managed to kill a Celestial, which shows just how powerful he really is. After that, he created an entire race of symbiotes from a living abyss, controlling them as part of a massive hive mind. Instead of being just a villain with a plan, he's more like a force of nature that spreads across worlds. This is also where creatures like symbiote dragons come into play, which adds another layer to how massive his story can get. But eventually, his connection to the symbiotes was broken, which allowed them to develop independence. That shift is important, because it shows that even something created for destruction can change over time. But Null himself doesn't change in the same way, and when he eventually returns, it leads to another massive invasion. When you look at all of that, it becomes clear that Null isn't the kind of character you introduce and then wrap up in a single movie. He's more like a long-term threat, similar to how Thanos was used in the MCU. Thanos didn't just appear out of nowhere and get defeated right away. He was built up slowly over several movies, even though he was mostly in the background at first. And because of that, his eventual arrival felt much bigger and more meaningful. Null should be treated in a similar way, even though he's arguably even more powerful. While Thanos was incredibly strong, he was still a mortal being at the end of the day. Null, on the other hand, is more like an ancient god, which makes his presence even more dangerous. But that also means his story needs time to develop, because if everything happens too quickly, it won't have the same impact. It's also worth noting that Sony seems to be taking a slightly different approach with Null compared to how Marvel handled Thanos. Thanos was teased for years before becoming the main villain, but Null is already being introduced more directly. Even though there were small hints before, like Venom mentioning the vast hive knowledge of the symbiotes, it wasn't as obvious. Now, with his appearance in Venom: The Last Dance, things are moving much faster, but that doesn't necessarily mean his story will end there. If anything, his debut could just be the beginning of something bigger. If Sony is planning to connect its characters more tightly, Null could be the central threat that brings them all together. Characters like Venom, Morbius, Kraven, and possibly even Spider-Man could all be affected by his presence. And that kind of shared conflict is exactly what the franchise needs if it wants to feel more connected and cohesive. Another important point is that Null's storyline in the comics, especially the King in Black arc, is massive. It involves multiple characters, multiple locations, and a scale that's much larger than a single film can handle. Even though Sony doesn't have access to every Marvel character, they still have enough to adapt the core idea. They can replace certain heroes with their own lineup and still tell a story that captures the same level of intensity. Now, when you look at the title, The Last Dance, it raises some interesting possibilities. It strongly suggests that something major is going to happen to Venom, possibly even his death. And while that might seem like a risky decision, it could actually work in favor of the larger story. If Null defeats Venom, it immediately establishes him as a serious threat. It also creates a turning point for the rest of the characters because they would have to step up and face something much bigger than anything they've dealt with before. This kind of moment would be similar to when Thanos won in Infinity War because it shifts the tone completely. Instead of ending things neatly, it leaves the story open for a bigger continuation. And that's exactly what Null needs, because his presence should feel ongoing, not temporary. So even if Venom falls, it doesn't mean the story ends there. In fact, it could just be the start of a larger conflict. There's also the possibility that Spider-Man could take a more central role after that. If Venom is no longer the main focus, the franchise would need another character to lead the story forward. And Spider-Man is the obvious choice, especially since he has such a strong connection to the symbiote storyline. That shift could help redefine the direction of the universe, making it feel more unified. Of course, there's still a chance that the movie could take a different route and end with both Venom and Null being defeated. That would create a dramatic and emotional ending, especially if it involves a sacrifice. It would also wrap up Venom's story in a powerful way, but at the same time, it would limit the future potential of the franchise because it removes one of its biggest threats. So, when you put everything together, it becomes clear that Null's role shouldn't be limited to just one movie. His story is too big, his power is too significant, and his impact is too wide to be contained like that. But if they rush his story or limit it too much, it could end up feeling wasted. So while nothing is confirmed yet, the smartest approach would be to let his story unfold across multiple films, building towards something bigger instead of trying to do everything at once.